Good evening. I'm not really used to public speaking. Most of the time I've done public speaking in the past, it's been from the witness box of the Old Bailey. So this is kind of new to me, so I hope you're not going to heckle me. I suppose I better start at the beginning, really. I was born in London, Charing Cross, grew up not too far from here, around the Holloway Road area. Until I was 9 years old, I was a pretty normal kid, moved to South London, Balham. When I was 14, my only experience of the police had been, I'd been arrested once for scrumping and got a clip round the ear, as you did in those days. And as far as the police were concerned, I thought they were all like Dicks and the Dock Green, or Z-Cars, which was my favourite programme at the time. When I was 14, I was taken off the streets by a burglary squad in South London with a friend of mine. We'd actually been playing truant from school. We hadn't been up to anything illegal, we weren't criminals, we were 14 years old. The burglary squad in question had quite a reputation at that time in South London. They drove around in old comma vans and painter and decorator vans, and they dressed in plain clothes in order to catch burglars, obviously. They got us into the back of the van, they smelt strongly of drink, and they proceeded to beat and torture the two of us. What they'd done to me was broke two of my fingers whilst in the van by twisting them. They made us confess to a series of burglaries we'd never committed and released us on bail to our parents. Eventually we got to the juvenile court, and I actually stood up and told the magistrate what had happened, that we'd been tortured by the police and that the burglaries we were actually charged with, we'd made them up. We hadn't actually burgled anywhere. Lucky enough, we had a kind magistrate who decided to remand the case and look into it, ordered the police to investigate, different police force. They found that the burglaries we were supposed to have done hadn't been done, and when we went back to court, the charges were dismissed and we were advised to sue the police, which we tried to do. This incident led, for me, to a hatred of the police, and particularly for what happened afterwards, which was because we were suing the police, and in those days it took 3 or 4 years to actually get a case through, we got harassed by the police on several occasions. They used to come and raid my mother's house 6 o'clock in the morning, saying they were looking for stolen goods, kick the door in, harass my little brother. So eventually we dropped the charges, but by then I was kind of on a path to being a criminal, if you like. I had a hatred of the police and all authority, and I decided to, in my own juvenile way, to become what they'd accused me of. So I kind of threw myself into crime. My main crimes were stealing motorbikes and getting the police to chase me. One night I stole a motorbike and pulled up outside Streatham Police Station after they'd been round to my house the day before and insulted my mother, and threw a brick through Streatham Police Station window and drove off on a motorbike. So it was like a sort of all-out war for me. I carried on, and eventually I went to a detention centre for 3 months. I was on remand a few times, and at the age of 16, I got into serious crime and appeared at the Old Bailey for armed robbery and possession of firearms. I was jailed for 3 years, served every day of the 3-year sentence in a series of juvenile jails, mainly Rochester Borstal. The Borstals in those days in the juvenile system they could be described as gladiator schools. Everybody, it was youngsters from the age of 14 to 21, all boys obviously, there was no mixed Borstals. And there was a lot of violence, and there was a lot of revolt, and there was a lot of riots, stuff like that. And I always found myself at the forefront of these. In the juvenile system, you had to prove how tough you were or you became a victim. And I kind of relished the fight against the system and fighting against other people who were in the same position as me. I suppose my life took the inevitable path after that. I got out Borstal having served my 3 years. Couldn't get a job really, wasn't interested in getting a job. And the contacts I'd made during that 3-year sentence allowed me to go on to bigger and worse crimes. I became a professional robber. There was only 1 year since 1976 when I didn't go to prison. That was 1981. That was the year my son was born, my first son. And really, I just spent my life as a professional criminal. And obviously, if you're a professional criminal, you're going to come up against the police, which I kind of relished again, and ended up in prison for a lot of years. As it was said in the introduction, I was released in May this year. Whilst in prison, I've got to explain first. When I first went to prison, because of all the truant I played from school and because of my criminality, I couldn't read or write properly. I knew enough to write my name, and I could count enough to count how much money I'd nicked, but that was about it. So whilst I was in Borstal, Christmas 1977, I tried to escape from Rochester Borstal and assaulted a night watchman with a steel bucket. Broke out my cell, assaulted the night watchman, very nearly got out of the Borstal, but I was captured and I was thrown into the punishment block. And the punishment block is, in Rochester it was an underground punishment block, and you were in a cell about the size of the average family bathroom, and they took your mattress out at 7 o'clock in the morning and they put it back in at 9 o'clock at night, and you were in a cell with nothing except for a plastic piss pot. You got a shower once a week and you never got exercise. When you were in the block in those days, you didn't get no fresh air, you didn't see no sunlight. The window was an opaque plastic pane, so you couldn't even see anything through that. And you can imagine 15, 16, I was 16 then, and it was just so boring, it nearly drove me mad. You were allowed one library book a day, but because I couldn't read, I would go out, get my book, and use it as a football in the cell to try and amuse myself. Eventually I got a visit from a Catholic priest who was in the Borstal and used to come down and see the lads down in the block. And he noticed that I wasn't reading my book and asked me why. So I told him I couldn't really read. So off his own back, the next time he came in, he brought me in some easy reading books, Janet and John, The Red Pirate, all that sort of stuff, Sea Spot Run. And I learned to read through these books. He would come in every day and give me a bit of advice on words that I didn't understand. And eventually, I after about 3 or 4 months, I gained a great love of reading. I became a voracious reader. I'd read anything I could get my hands on. And really it sustained me through a lot of prison sentences. Back in those days, there was no televisions in prison, and in Borstal you couldn't even have a radio. So, it helped me through my sentence being able to read. I never ever thought about writing until years later. I finished my sentence and went back to being a professional criminal. Bank robbery was really my milieu. And I committed over 200 bank robberies throughout the 80s and 90s, for which, when I was captured, I paid the price. I was captured in 1986. I was given a 26-year sentence, which was reduced to 19 years on appeal. And I served 11 years out of that sentence, during which time I spent most of it reading. Eventually, if you read a lot, I've no doubt you get to the stage that I got to where I'd read everything I really wanted to read, and I was looking for new books to read, and sometimes I'd take 3 or 4 books out of the prison library, and some of them I'd get maybe a chapter in and just say, no good, can't read it. And I used to wonder how these books had got published in the first place, because a lot of them were rubbish. I was going to say something else, but So anyway, that started me thinking that maybe I might be able to write. I thought to myself, well, if people can get this sort of stuff published, then maybe there's room for me. So I started writing little pieces for prison magazines, that kind of thing, short stories. And eventually, I was in Dartmoor prison. I've got to explain, during all this time, I was a very troublesome prisoner. I was the kind of fellow who would lead the riot or the sit-down, assault prison officers, assault other inmates. I was never settled in prison, even though it was my home, to all intents and purposes, because I was serving so long. I could never settle down in jail. I always had to be doing something. So whilst I used to read at night, in the daytime I was a bit of a handful around the prisons. This led to me being shipped out of a lot of prisons, and I ended up serving time. I think there's 147 prisons in England and Wales, and I've served time in 49 of them. So, as I say, I was a bit of a handful, kept getting shipped around, and but kept reading. I was in Dartmoor prison, and I decided to try my hand at writing. And there was a short story competition with a £10 prize. It was just an inter-prison competition, and I entered it and came second. So that gave me the encouragement to think that I might be able to do something writing. Obviously, that was only a sideline for me because I kept on doing what I was doing. Writing never really put me off committing crime or being a nuisance in prison. What it did was it gave me the education that I needed to make more complaints. This time written complaints. And I soon found out through this that it seemed to hurt the system more. And don't forget, I hated the system. They were holding me against my will. It seemed to hurt the system more if I actually put in written complaints, because that meant they'd have to go to all the trouble of answering the complaints than if I just went along the landing and punched a screw in the head. Because if I'd done that, they'd just beat me up and lose me 28 days. So I saw the light there and decided to become a professional complaint writer. I'd do it for other prisoners as well, but I always made sure that none of my complaints were trivial or groundless. They were proper things that needed changing. So I became a pain in the neck to the prison system, and eventually I was released. Before I was released, I decided to enter some story competitions that were going on outside and had a bit of success there. And kind of, I always thought of writing as sort of a hobby. I was released in 1996, I think it was. See, the old memory's going too many punches in the head. Released in 1996, and 1997, sorry, I was out for a year, committed another series of armed robberies and was jailed again for life under the Two Strikes Act. Went into prison with an 11-year tariff, which was one of the longest given out at the time. And whilst I'd been out, through John McVicker, who was an ex-public enemy #1 from the 60s, he escaped from Durham Special Unit and wrote his own book and had a film made out of the book when he got out in 1979 and became a journalist and a respected writer. And through John McVicker, I was introduced to a writer called Will Self. I went to a dinner party at his house. I'd been out 2 weeks, didn't have a clue, and John said to me, "Do you fancy coming round to meet Will Self? He's a really good writer and he likes your short stories." So I said, "Well, I don't know, John. Dinner party sounds a bit middle class to me." So he said, "Look, I'll be there." He said, "It's not like you'll be there on your own." He said, "Like, you know me, so, I'll be there and everything will be great." So I said, "Okay, then what time is it? Where's the address?" I turned up on the night, knocked on the door. Will Self opened the door, said hello, asked him if John was there. He said, "John's phoned, he's not coming." So I was stuck there with 4 or 5 people who I didn't know, and they were all quite obviously well educated and in a world that I'd never been part of. They were talking about problems in the Middle East and things like that, and I'd come from a place where the most you talked about was what time was slop out. So I was very quiet, but I did kind of enjoy listening to what they were saying. And at the end of the night, Will spoke to me. He was writing a short story about Wandsworth Prison. And I kind of give him a few details of what it would be like to be in prison, which he used in the story. And that was the last I seen of him. So I went on a robbery spree, again, and was arrested and was given 2-strike life. Whilst I was in prison, around about 1999, I wrote a short story and decided to send it to Will and ask him if he fancied coming up to visit me and giving me a few tips on writing. So eventually, Will wrote back and came to see me, and his thing was, look, if you're going to be a criminal, I can't really do anything. If you're going to change your ways and decide to do something with your life and make something out of the writing that you can do, then I'll help you. Cut a long story short, a couple of years later in 2001, I was in Whitemore prison and my youngest son died. I built myself into such an ogre in the eyes of the prison system that they wouldn't let me go to his funeral. So I decided, after a period of grieving, that I was going to change my life and that prison was not the way to go and neither was crime. And from that moment forward, I decided that I'd had enough. So I volunteered for HMP Grenham, which is a unique prison in Europe, I think, in the whole of Europe. It's in Buckinghamshire, and it deals with rehabilitating prisoners through therapy. And that's what my latest book is about, the 5 years I spent at Grenham. I hope you enjoy it if you read it. Thanks very much.